What if the real coding superpower was not typing faster? What if God mode coding had almost nothing to do with raw speed and everything to do with control? Because that is the illusion a lot of people still have. They imagine the ultimate coding workflow is one where you barely think, barely review, barely test, and some miracle AI just spits out perfect software on command. That is fantasy. The real God mode workflow looks different. It is not no-effort coding. It is high-leverage coding. A system where you stop acting like a human autocomplete machine and start acting like an operator, an architect, a reviewer, a loop designer, someone who can turn intention into working software faster because the workflow itself is smarter. That is where the real power is now. Not just in the model, in the loop. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because the best developers are not being replaced by AI, they are becoming force multipliers. They are learning how to move through software differently. Spec first, context loaded, scope tight, agent focused, small iteration, immediate test, fast feedback, review hard, refine, ship, repeat. That is the workflow. And when it clicks, it feels almost unfair. You stop wasting energy on blank page friction. You stop burning hours on boilerplate. You stop context switching yourself into stupidity. You stop manually crawling through every low-value task just because that is how coding used to work. Instead, you build momentum. That is what God mode actually feels like. Not magic. Momentum. The first part of the workflow is clarity. Not code. Clarity. This is where most people sabotage themselves before they even start. They open the IDE, fire up an AI coding assistant, dump in a vague request, and expect brilliance. Then they get a plausible-looking mess and decide the tool is overrated. But the tool was never the main problem. The prompt was fuzzy. The scope was sloppy. The outcome was undefined. AI is brutally sensitive to ambiguity. If you give it a blurry task, it gives you blurry code. If you give it too much room, it fills the room with guesses. So the God mode workflow starts by turning the idea into something the machine can actually execute. What are we building? What is the exact behavior? What file or module matters? What is in scope? What is explicitly out of scope? What counts as done? That sounds basic. It is not basic. It is leverage. Because once the target is sharp, the workflow accelerates. The second part is context. This is another place where average AI-assisted coding falls apart. A model without context is like a contractor dropped into the middle of a city with no map, no blueprint, and no clue which building it is supposed to touch. Of course, it makes weird choices. The God mode workflow feeds the right context at the right time. Relevant files, existing patterns, constraints, architectural expectations, naming conventions, data flow, tests, known bugs. Not the whole universe, just the sharp slice that matters. That is the trick. Too little context and the model hallucinates. Too much and it drowns. So high-leverage developers do not just prompt better. They frame better. They know what the agent needs, and just as importantly, what it does not. That is a huge distinction. Because God mode coding is not giving the AI unlimited freedom. It is creating a runway. Enough structure to move fast. Enough boundaries to stay sane. Then comes the part people love most. Generation. This is the flashy bit. The AI scaffolds the service, builds the component, writes the migration, creates the test file, explains the bug, suggests the refactor, maybe even touches 5 files in one pass. And yes, that part is genuinely powerful. Tasks that used to cost an hour can suddenly cost 5 minutes, sometimes less. But here is the catch. If generation is the whole workflow, you do not have God mode. You have a slot machine. Because the real workflow is not generate and pray. It is generate, inspect, and tighten the loop. That is where serious developers separate from tourists. They do not confuse speed of output with speed of progress. That distinction matters more than ever. Bad AI-assisted coding feels fast right until the moment you realize you now own 50 lines of elegant nonsense wired into the wrong abstraction. Good AI-assisted coding feels disciplined. You ask for a small move. You verify it. You run the test. You inspect the diff. You correct the direction. Then you ask for the next move. This is why the best workflow is built from short loops, not giant leaps. One feature slice. One refactor step. One interface update. One failing test fixed. One endpoint tightened. Each loop produces signal. Each loop reduces uncertainty. Each loop tells you whether the machine actually understands the task or is just doing a very convincing impression of understanding. That is one of the deepest truths in modern coding. You do not scale trust by hoping harder. You scale trust through loops. Fast loops, tight loops, measured loops. That means tests matter even more now, not less. A lot of people think AI-assisted development reduces the need for testing because the model already knows best practices. That is exactly backwards. When code generation gets cheaper, verification becomes more important. If an agent can create 10 times more code in the same amount of time, then weak review and weak testing become 10 times more dangerous. So the God mode workflow treats tests like navigation, not bureaucracy. Before the code, maybe you define the expected behavior. After the code, you run the test immediately. If it fails, the loop is still alive. If it passes, you inspect whether it passed for the right reason. That last part is crucial. Because AI can absolutely produce code that passes a shallow check while still violating the spirit of the system. It can satisfy the letter and miss the soul. That is why review still matters. And not checkbox review. Real review. Does this match the architecture? Does it create hidden complexity? Does it introduce weird coupling? Is the naming honest? Will another human understand this later? Did the AI solve the actual problem or just silence the symptom? That is where the human becomes more valuable, not less. The machine accelerates production. The human protects coherence. That is a powerful division of labor. And the strongest developers are already learning to live in that role. Not as typists, as editors of execution. That shift is enormous. The old workflow made your value look like output. How much code did you write? How fast did you type? How many tickets did you close manually? The new workflow makes your value look more like judgment. What did you ask for? How did you frame it? How quickly did you detect drift? How well did you decompose the task? How well did you design the loop the agent worked inside? That is why God mode coding is less about hacking faster and more about orchestrating better. You are not trying to be the fastest pair of hands in the room anymore. You are trying to be the cleanest decision maker in the loop. And that changes the whole feeling of software work. It becomes less about brute force and more about flow control. You move from line-by-line struggle into a rhythm. Frame the task. Feed the context. Generate the slice. Run the test. Review the diff. Correct the path. Commit the win. Repeat. When that rhythm is locked in, the workflow becomes addictive. Not because it is lazy, because it is lucid. You stay close to the intention. You spend less time in mechanical sludge. You preserve energy for architecture, product thinking, debugging strategy, and design judgment. That is the hidden gift. The best AI coding workflow does not just make you faster, it gives your brain back. And in software, that is everything. Because the real bottleneck was never only typing, it was cognitive drag. Remembering everything, holding edge cases in your head, switching between files, rebuilding context after interruptions, fighting boilerplate, losing momentum every time a tiny implementation detail broke your train of thought. The God mode workflow strips a lot of that friction away. Not all of it, but enough to matter. That is why some teams are reporting dramatic gains when they learn how to work this way. Not because the AI is mystical, because the workflow is finally respecting the economics of attention. That is the real unlock. Human attention is expensive. AI generation is cheap. So the winning workflow spends human attention where it is rare and valuable, and spends machine effort where it is abundant and disposable. That means humans decide. Machines draft. Humans review. Machines iterate. Humans set the bar. Machines help climb toward it. That is the partnership. But there is one more piece, and it might be the most important one. The workflow has to stay grounded. Because the moment you start believing your own automation hype, you get sloppy. You stop checking. You stop narrowing scope. You stop reading diffs properly. You stop noticing architectural drift. And then the workflow turns on you. What felt like God mode becomes bug mode, tech debt mode, regression mode, false confidence mode. So the real discipline is humility. Use the machine aggressively, trust the machine cautiously. That is the balance. Push for speed, demand evidence, push for leverage, keep your standards, push for flow, preserve control. That is how you stay dangerous in the good way. And maybe that is the cleanest definition of the God mode coding workflow. It is not a workflow where the machine replaces the engineer. It is a workflow where the engineer stops wasting themselves on low-level friction and starts operating at the level that actually matters. Intent, structure, feedback, judgment, iteration. That is the stack. Once you build your coding life around that loop, you are not just coding faster. You are coding with amplified reach. And that is why the people who master this will feel almost unfairly effective. Not because they found a magic button, but because they learned how to combine human judgment with machine execution inside a loop that compounds. That is God mode. Not infinite power, just ridiculous leverage applied with discipline.